A very good evening to all of you. My name is Cecile Shea. I am a non-resident senior fellow here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. We would like to welcome all of you to this very important program tonight. I have a few housekeeping items. First of all, this is on the record this evening, and it is being live streamed over the internet, so please be aware of both of those things. If I could ask all of you to double check that you have silenced your phones, please. I want to just let you know of three really interesting programs that are coming up in the future for the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. On Tuesday, April 4th in the evening, MIT professor Simon Johnson will discuss the global economy in the Trump era. Yeah. On Wednesday, April 5th, this will be a very interesting one. Wednesday, April 5th, the Canadian Finance Minister, Bill Morneau, on U.S.-Canada trade and investment. And on Wednesday, April 12th, we are honored to host Admiral Harry Harris in the evening. He is the commander of all of the U.S. forces in the Pacific. One final note, I understand we have several representatives of our Young Professionals program here this evening. If you are a young professional or if you know a young professional, we welcome you to participate in the Council's excellent Young Professionals program. Are there any ambassadors who are here this evening? Could you stand? You're welcome to talk to these are our YP ambassadors. If you have questions about the program, just ask them after this evening. So thank you very much. A few words about our guests. We are very honored to welcome both of them tonight. First of all, Andrei Kozyrev to my far left. Very welcome. Andrei is currently a distinguished fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center in Washington, D.C. He is the former foreign minister of Russia. He was the foreign minister there from 1990 to 1996. So you were there for the beginning. After he left his job as foreign minister, he represented the city of Murmansk in the Duma. We are particularly happy to be thanking tonight and working with the Kennan Center at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Andrei is here tonight as part of the Kennan Conversations program at the Kennan Institute. The Kennan Conversation program brings top experts on Russia and the region to cities across the United States so that local audiences, like us, have the opportunity to listen to and engage with these experts and learn more about this important part of the world. Sitting directly to my left is Arkady Ostrovsky. Arkady is currently the Russia and Eastern European editor for The Economist. Previous to this, he was the Moscow bureau chief for The Economist. You've been with The Economist for, I believe, about 10 years now. Prior to that, Arkady was with the Financial Times covering Russian issues, again, for 10 years. Arkady published an excellent book this summer. It received the very prestigious Orwell Prize. Our partners, the bookseller, will be selling copies of this book after the event, and I can very highly recommend it, and don't just take my word for it. The New York Times review of the book was one of the best I've seen in the Times. The book is The Invention of Russia from Gorbachev's Freedom to Putin's War. So please join me in welcoming both of these outstanding men to the Council. I thought we could maybe just lay a foundation of what the situation is in Russia right now, writ large, and then move to some of the topics that I know everyone wants to hear about. So, Arkady, let's start with you. 60 to 90 seconds. What's the economy like? What is the economy like in Russia right now?
Okay. The Economist is known for being concise, but not that concise. No, I mean, as I was saying to you just before we walked in, it was once President Yeltsin was asked this question at some international gathering of foreign investors, and he already rambled for a bit, and then somebody stood up and said, Mr. President, could you just summarize for us, and this was early 90s, could you summarize for us in just in one word the state of Russian economy? Yeltsin thought and said, good. And then said, okay, Mr. President, maybe in 2 words? Said, not good. So I actually think it's pretty, I'll try. Okay, 60 seconds starting now. The state of economy is not good, but it's not disastrous. Russia is, at the moment, is in recession. It had been in stagnation for the past pretty much 3 years. There are projections that Russia will turn a corner and will return to growth in the next year. But whatever happens, it's not going to be anything like what we've seen in the early 2000s, and even after the financial crisis of 2008, which was a V-shaped crisis. It was a very deep drop of about 15% in GDP, and a very quick recovery, mainly due to enormous injection of money into the economy from the public sector. Russian economy started slowing down before the sanctions. Basically, what we've seen in the 2000s, the growth began actually at the tail end of '98, even probably before that, when some of the reforms that were implemented by Yegor Gaidar, who was Russia's first prime minister, served with Minister Kozyrev. Those market reforms started to work, but of course Russia had also the benefit of the rising oil prices, and the 2000s were basically the era of recovery. That recovery, after the Soviet decline, ran its course and ran out of steam by 2012, when Russian growth slowed down drastically. The Western sanctions have tipped it into recession. And that obviously was also the effect of the falling oil price. I would argue that even if the sanctions were to be lifted today, unless we see a recovery in the oil price, not just a recovery in the oil price to the mid-2000 levels, but actually continuing growing price of oil, Russian economy is not going to return to growth. It simply doesn't have investment. The only growth that Russia can have would be investment growth, and nobody's investing in Russia. Neither foreign businessmen, nor more importantly, Russian businessmen are investing in their economy because of the unpredictability, because of the lack of clear rules, more so than even the rule of law, just the total unpredictability, and of course the geopolitics, which weighs in everybody's mind.
Sure.
I think that was 60 seconds.
Well, thank you. That was excellent, though. And we'll come back to the issue of sanctions and the Ukraine in a little while. So, Andrei, so I saved the easy one for you. Could you give us a little bit of background on the political situation in Russia right now?
Of course.
And is President Putin for life? I guess that's one of the questions.
Yeah, in one word, it's bad. In two words, it's going even worse. Almost daily, I am sorry to say. And it started from a rather low point. It was very difficult in our time. And you said that I was there from the beginning. It's actually correct. From the beginning of the new Russia as opposed to the Soviet Union. And I bear and I own responsibility for what happened. We were unable to come out. I mean, it's Gaidar and our team, we were unable to come out with our own initiative, with our own leadership, as separate from Yeltsin. Yeltsin was very good to challenge the communist system, partly because he was in rivalry with Gorbachev, personal animosity and rivalry, partly because he was good enough to recognize the unsustainability of the communist system. But he was not, frankly speaking, as good for construction work, for continuation of the reform. And as early as December 1992, that is just in 10, 11 months, he fired Yegor Gaidar, by the way, and economic reforms started to stagnate more and more. And he was not able mostly to fully understand, I think, a reform process before him and argue for that, to promote it daily, to argue to the parliament and so on. And we tried to help him and to push him into what we thought the right direction of continuation of reform, but we did not come with our own leader, young leader or something. As of today, the situation deteriorated to the point under President Putin, to the point when there are no elections as free and fair process. There is no, almost no free press, very, very small segments. But the electronic media and TV, which is the source for, I think, more than 60, if not 80% of Russian population, the main source of news, it's totally dominated by directly state, not censored, but controlled media. And the parliament, which was, in my time, I was in parliament, I was directly elected by people in Murmansk area 2 times, and it was competitive free election, and I had once 11 and next time 10 or 9 competitors, very, very tough and critical, and sometimes, but not as I would say, maybe unpolite and as uncivilized as we saw just recently. I couldn't believe my eyes and my ears in the United States. But anyway, it was very, very tough, and but that ceased to be. There are no more competitive elections. So it's one-man show. There is discussion between political scientists, whether it's dictatorship, whether it's mild dictatorship. I think dictatorship is dictatorship. There's no way, to my mind, to label it differently. It's one-man show. In a sense, as Arkady, I highly recommend this book. I enjoyed reading this book. It's a fantastic piece of craftsmanship. And as he says in some first pages, I think, that today it's in many aspects even worse than in the Soviet Union, right? And I think that that's absolutely correct characterization. I think it speaks for itself, even worse than the Soviet Union. So that's where we are. Is it 60 seconds?
Perfect, right on the dot. Thank you. So, continuing on a similar theme, there were some significant demonstrations over the weekend, not just in Moscow, but in many cities around Russia, and I guess even some outside of Russia, in some Russian towns. In Poland, I read, I don't know. But let's start with you, Arkady. Could you tell us what these demonstrations mean, and more broadly, what is the status of human rights and free thought in Russia these days?
Okay. It's complex. I think the events which we saw on Sunday, and for those of you who might not have, we had demonstrations varying in size, but tens of thousands of people. Smaller than we saw 5 years ago in 2011, 2012, when Putin returned for his third presidential term, but in many ways much more alarming for the Kremlin. I would say very significant event, at least it seems like it at the moment. I'm very glad that the US media has picked on it, and the international media has picked on it. The New York Times today has had a lead story and dedicated an entire page to it, which I think is absolutely appropriate. Because I think we are possibly seeing I wouldn't say beginning, but a continuation of the process which we began to watch in 2011 and 2012. And I would not bet anymore that, I'll be provocative, but I would not bet that President Putin is going to be in power in a year's time.
Really?
Yeah. I think one of the potential mistakes, since we're in Chicago and it's a great honor and privilege to be speaking at this event, I've been meeting with some State Department officials in Washington. I never met Secretary Tillerson, but I think one of the possible dangers that the US administration might be making, I'm not talking about Trump, that's a separate story, or not a separate story, as I hope to prove. I mean, the funny thing about this book, when I started writing it, I just, it was a book about Russia. I just had, it was about what happened in Russia, and suddenly I started seeing sort of, tweets and stuff and saying, this is a weird book about Russia, but it's actually not about Russia, it's about America. So I had to revise and update. There was a new paperback edition coming out in Penguin in the summer, which is with a preface, which is all about Putin and Trump. But putting that to the side and returning to your question, I think there is a possible danger in terms of foreign policy where, because of who Secretary Tillerson is, because of his experience with President Putin and his circle, that there is a conviction in the US government that Putin is there for a very long time. I think these protests are very, very serious. Now, what are they about? So some of the slogans we've seen are very similar to the ones we saw 5 years ago. Russia without Putin. The protests have been galvanized by the same man, who's now in jail for 15 days, which means the Kremlin has been completely stunned by what happened. Nobody saw it happening.
And this is Mr. Navalny?
This is Alexei Navalny, who is started as a blogger, who is a completely new type of a politician, I would say sort of American-style politician, in many ways unaffiliated with any party, with a very large following, who managed to circumvent the state monopoly on television through the internet, through YouTube. He released a video not long ago about corruption of Dmitry Medvedev. That's also very important. He is clearly a very talented politician. He zoomed in and targeted Medvedev, who is kind of, in a lot of Russian public mind, is a ridiculous figure. And as far as the elite is concerned, he is equally disliked by Putin's cronies.
And this is the former prime minister.
He's a current prime minister. He's a former president.
Okay, there we go.
He is a former president who the administration of Barack Obama and Secretary Clinton tried to build up as the real thing, which I thought was a big mistake. Anyway, he is equally disliked by the Siloviki, the hardliners from with a background in security services, and by the technocrats and kind of quasi-liberals. So he picked on Medvedev. People were not scared to come out against Medvedev. Also, Putin is credited with Russia's geopolitical resurgence. Medvedev is associated with decline in Russian economy, so people came out. Now, what's important is that what we saw 5 years ago was largely confined to Moscow. These were successful, young, middle-aged, middle-class Muscovites who were doing very well out of the oil price. They wanted modern state, they wanted services, they wanted kind of a modern agenda, largely pro-Western. This time, yes, Moscow had the same kind of people, hipsters, a lot of them, but there's been a change in the generation, enormously important. A lot of people who came out in the street, 30%, we think were under the age of 18. So these are the contemporaries of Putin's presidency. They were born in the year that Putin became president. They are fed up with Putin because he's out of fashion, he's old, he's not cool, and they like Navalny, who's a kind of a real guy, real dude, kind of charismatic, etc. They're different. The protests are different in social structure. There were a lot of angry people on the streets, not in Moscow, but in places like Vladivostok and the industrial centers. So think of Ohio, think of Pennsylvania, where people are coming out on the streets because they don't see any prospects for them in the future. So they were angrier, broader in terms of social structure. They were regionally much bigger. they're very hard, and they're very hard for the Kremlin to deal with, which is why the Kremlin is so stunned and treated this protest with a mixture of police, but reasonably little violence. I mean, there were nasty pictures, but nothing on there was no Tiananmen Square or even something like happens in Belarus. And with the silence by television channels because they just don't know how to react. The difficulty the Kremlin now has, which is why I'm saying these are very, very serious events for Russia's future, is twofold. Russia has lost America as an arch enemy. So anti-Americanism, the Kremlin cannot, the television channels cannot just suddenly say, okay, this is again Hillary Clinton and the State Department paying for it because it's been trumpeting, sorry, that's hailing Trump's victory as the end of liberal interventionism. It cannot say Secretary Tillerson has paid for this. So America's gone as an enemy. That's important. What they did in 2012, they managed to hijack the agenda of those protests with this sort of imperial nationalism and with the annexation of Crimea. The euphoria which the annexation of Crimea and the war in Ukraine produced is wearing out, largely, partly because of economy, partly because of just the fact of time. So I think this is a very, very dangerous situation where basically the Kremlin has very few tools of dealing with this. Either they can start beating these people up. This is dangerous because, okay, you can beat people up in Moscow and the parents of these kids will probably just do nothing. But again, imagine somebody, a Russian equivalent of steelworks in Pennsylvania. You are 42, 43-year-old, your 16, 17-year-old daughter has been beaten up by the police. What are you going to do? You're going to come out much stronger. And these people are not going to be shy. So Putin's only option, which is why I think we are moving into very dangerous ground, is another war. And that could be absolutely anywhere. It could be continuation of the war in Ukraine. It could be Belarus. They could have try to have another bite of some former Soviet territory. But they have, as of today, the Kremlin has a problem.
Wow. That's really sobering. Do you have anything to add to that?
You know what, I believe the audience will be disappointed. You're recently especially used to political shows, that fight and all that kind of animation. But in this case, we are so much on the same wavelength that whatever Arkady says, I can only agree to. So it's very little what I can add. Actually, in my own family, my daughter lives in Moscow. She's, by the way, Columbia University graduate, and there are her friends like her, foreign or very highly educated domestically, but I have also other sources from some other cities. They are not relatives, but they are my friends, including Murmansk, those who helped and supported me during the campaign 20 years ago. We are still very much keeping friendly relations. And now they all argue online, on the internet, on Facebook, what are the consequences. In assessment of those events, they agree that it's new, there are much more young people, and the perception what they had from those rallies, which they mostly participated themselves, is that it's less of this intellectual middle class, or creative class, as they call it in Russia, but more of a kind of ordinary people, like workers or blue collars and so on. So it's real change. It seems like a real change. But the discussion is whether it's just an event, however exciting, but which will just disappear like previous, more or less, rallies. They were very impressive, huge, bigger even by numbers, but they kind of went down after that, and the Kremlin found how to maneuver out of that. So the question is whether it's a beginning of something or just an event. And I have to say that the minds differ so much, even inside my closest circle of friends and relatives. And frankly speaking, I'm of two minds too, but what I try to tell them and what I might add here is that actually you never know. I mean, these days, especially with this communication, networks so fast, and the mood of people changing so fast. After Brexit and Trump's victory and all that, I mean, you never know anymore. But especially, you never know and never knew even before internet in Russia, because Russia is known by its unpredictability. And I remember when we came to government, to power in early 90s, 2 years before that, I mean, before the Soviet Union dissolved, nobody, neither in Washington, nor in Paris, nor in Moscow, neither inside Russia, nobody would be taken as a serious, kind of predictor, a serious mind to tell that the Soviet Union would be dissolved, to just cease to exist, and the Communist Party and the KGB, which resurrected though later, but at that time, I mean, it was unthinkable, and yet it happened. So it's so unpredictable that you never know. Maybe we need to watch, but it's exciting. It becomes again exciting to watch. That's important, because it looked so dull for last 2-3 years, as Arkady said, that everybody thought that Russia is kind of closed and lost case. It's very, very refreshing, and it makes it worth watching, monitoring again.
Interesting, thank you.
Yes, Igor Gaidar, who Minister Kozarov said with once said, in Russia big changes happen later than we think, but earlier than we expect.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting, very interesting. Well, so we kind of alluded to the election and to the new president here in the United States, so maybe we could spend a minute discussing that. There are some pretty credible accusations that Russia attempted to manipulate in one way or another the US election. What do you think about all this? And do you think they expect, I mean, what you just said tells me that maybe they didn't think all of this through as completely as they might have. Do you think that they are having any buyer's remorse at this point?
Look, what do we know? We know that Trump's victory was celebrated in the Russian parliament and the Kremlin with champagne. We know that Russian television has been, again, sort of completely pro-Trump. We know that Russian security services have hacked into the DNC systems, into DNC computers, actually hacked into both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, but only released the emails from the Democratic Party. I think this was very short-sighted. I think President Clinton would have been far more beneficial to Putin. Predictable, not that strong, but most of all predictable. It would have been a continuation of Obama years, and that would have suited actually the Kremlin propaganda purposes much better. Now Russia has President Trump, who is utterly unpredictable. I would not, again, I've already been so kind of obsessed with the idea of potential grand bargain between Putin and Trump. My view is that the opposite is more likely. I think whatever it is that Putin, I'll come back to your question in a second in terms of reaction to those, because I think that the reactions are important both from the Democratic side and the Republican side. But whatever it is that Putin might have wanted to do, whatever it is Trump that might have wanted to do, or Manafort or Michael Flynn, if you look just at the facts calmly, it massively backfired, right? Because Russia has become so toxic, both in the United States and now in Europe. I just been to Berlin. The Social Democratic Party, the SPD, which has always traditionally been about Ostpolitik, about Russia, has removed Russia from the list of its top policy issues because everybody is just scared to talk about Russia. Ambassador Kislyak is probably the most toxic figure. I mean, I almost kind of feel for him that nobody, people are scared to talk to him.
And that's the Russian ambassador to Washington.
Russian ambassador to Washington. So between the Democrats who blame, and I'll come back to that in a second, who blame Russia for Clinton's defeat, and traditional Republicans like Senator McCain, the room for maneuver in the Trump administration is very, very narrow. The result of all this is actually, I would argue, we don't know who's going to be in the State Department. We don't know who is going to fill the most important jobs in the Pentagon. But if you just look at the most senior people now dealing with Russia in the United States, this is a very formidable, incredibly knowledgeable, and not at all a soft team. So we have National Security Council Secretary McMaster, who's just hired probably one of the best Russian analysts in America, if not the world, Fiona Hill, the author of a fantastic book I strongly recommend called Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin, which Fiona served in the Obama administration at the National Intelligence Council. Absolutely brilliant book jointly with Cliff Gaddy. She's been at Brookings. She is now going to be the head of Europe at the NSC, in charge of Russia, Western Europe, and Turkey. We have Secretary Mattis. By the way, McMaster was the one who authored a paper on refocusing American military on Russia's threat. We have Secretary Mattis. We have, as I said, we have Rex Tillerson, who, whatever he does with that knowledge is a different matter, but knows how corrupt the system is. And last and not least at all, not in America, but in your northern neighbor,
yes.
In Canada, we have incredibly ambitious, young, and ideologically driven foreign minister or minister for global affairs, Chrystia Freeland, who was a former colleague and a good friend at the Financial Times. So we have a very strong Russia team. My fear is, just looking at the reaction and the amount of news that Russia produces in America at the moment, is that both Democrats who blame, as I said, Kremlin for their candidate's defeat, and some of the Republicans like Trump, like Steve Bannon, who see Putin and Russia as a sort of this beacon of macho nationalism, are doing exactly what America's greatest diplomat and thinker, George Kennan, had advised us not to do when he wrote his long telegram in 1946, which I still think is the most remarkable piece of writing by any diplomat, and it was not an accident that he was the only one Stalin kicked out of the Soviet Union, because Stalin recognized that Kennan understood how the system really works. Now, Kennan's biggest advice was that it's not going to be about military deterrence. It is going to be about the vitality and the strength and vigor of American democracy, which is exactly what it was in the end. That's what actually undermined the Soviet Union, not the military. And he said the worst thing, at the end of this telegram, he said the worst thing we can do is to start copying the way of the adversary with whom we're coping. And I'm afraid that is exactly what we're doing, that the Democrats are blaming Russians exactly in the same way as Putin blamed Americans for the protests that started in 2011-12.
Thank you very much. It's an excellent summary. So since you are visiting, courtesy of the George Kennan Institute, Do you have anything to add, or do you have any thoughts on the gentleman who is leading the current protests? Is he a realistic successor?
Navalny?
Yes.
Yeah, this is very, very interesting figure, a little bit unknown in a sense still. I mean, despite for many years already he is at the forefront of the political process and perceived leader of the opposition, maybe, but the definition of this opposition is also very broad. It's like anti-Putin, anti-corruption. Corruption, by the way, is very, very powerful trigger for revolutions. I remember even Marie Antoinette, who said that if they don't have bread, let them eat cakes, and that actually ignited the great French Revolution. And in Russia, for instance, when the war appropriations in 1916 were stolen, and that became also exposed in media at that time, not even in social media, of course, but just in few papers in the Imperial Russia, and that actually again triggered the large discontent and finally led to great kind of revolution. Tsar went, and then Bolsheviks came. And even in our times, Yeltsin, President Yeltsin, whom I was advising and helping at that time, he ran on anti-corruption agenda, also exposing communists as lying that they are kind of egalitarian and that they are for equality for everyone, while living much better lives. Nothing comparable with today's, of course, Russian leaders, but still very different, much better life than the population in the Soviet Union. So that was important. So I would not underestimate the point which Mr. Navalny makes, puts in the center of his agenda. But otherwise, it's somewhat ambiguous, somewhat unclear. Where is he? Is he on the right? Is he on the left? I mean, what would be his agenda? And as Arkady said, that president in the United States is, as you said, completely unpredictable or something like that. I mean, it probably will happen the same if tomorrow something real happens in Russia. It will be, I think, it would be Navalny, because he is the only figure today which we can think of as a alternative to Putin. But what would be his agenda? It will be as unpredictable as possible. So in a sense, it's a big question mark. And I would even try to say a few words. Arkady, relax. I mean, you said that in a sense that they have difficulty today in Moscow to blame America. It's no problem. They will. and the propaganda there, I mean, the whatever Fox News is just a kindergarten, and they control the whole thing. I mean, as I said, they control it. Even they have an army today. I think it's also today. No, it's today in Wall Street Journal. I think that about the army of Russian trollings and Russian special forces working in internet, through the internet. And so when you read, even when I listen to your brilliant presentations on Echo Moskvy, that is one of the almost free stations, radio stations, very limited though, in Moscow and in Russia. And but when I read the comments, I can easily see that lots of those are coming from the Kremlin side. You know, that all this kind of speculations and false accusations and all that. So they are working on internet too, and that there is no problem. And after all, I mean, how Obama became that kind of demonized figure in Russia, despite he was always criticized by, for instance, Republicans and a large part of the Democrats in America, and by a majority of Russians, Russian democratically minded people, for being weak to Russia. I mean, his response to Crimea, for instance, it was very delayed and it was feeble and it was small steps instead in front of the military aggression. And they tried this reset, famous reset. So Obama was much more forthcoming than any previous American administration I could remember in trying to negotiate with Putin and accommodate Putin, and he also continued to negotiate with Medvedev. I mean, I'm sorry, but I was always perplexed that he took him seriously. I mean, nobody in Russia took Medvedev seriously. He was a figurehead. He was just a puppet, kind of, to formally observe or formally follow the constitution, which prevented Putin from being third time a president. So he put Medvedev on that, and then he just removed him after 4 years, but he was always behind him, and he was really in power. So it's amazing. But Obama even pretended or believed. I don't think he's a very smart guy. So I don't think he believed actually that Medvedev is independent, real kind of president. But he even pretended that he's real president in order to engage Russia. So I can't imagine somebody who will do more to engage Russia, and yet, despite all that, he was portrayed and he's still portrayed. So there is no problem for Putin's propaganda to demonize Trump or whoever at the moment. There is another interesting point. A big bargain is it's non-starter. I mean, it's just fantasy, because there is no big bargain. What Russia could offer in a big bargain to America or to the West? Nothing. Participation in Syria, in real fight against ISIS, forget it. I mean, you know better than me that they will never fight ISIS for Syria. I mean, they pretend that they're fighting for Assad regime. And fighting ISIL is a two-edged sword for them. First of all, they don't want really to anger the ISIL and the terrorists, because they are vulnerable in Russia. Lots of those guys fighting in Russia, and after all, they are more closer religiously to Russian Muslims, whatever it's worth, though, but to Muslims in Russia than Assad and Iran, which is Shia. And the CIS countries in Asian republics, which we don't have really controlled borders with, and they are predominantly Muslim. So I think Kremlin is very, very cautious not to actually fight them. all that discussion that it's better to defeat them there in Syria rather than inside Russia, it's more like a talk. They are very tough. They are very seriously fighting them, the terrorists in Russia, but they don't want to increase the level of to the international fight. So that number one. Number two, let us not forget that the core of the military, professional military, which actually provided success, military success for ISIL. I mean, could you believe a bunch of ideological like savages just fighting this kind of sophisticated war, gaining this kind of territory, fighting American or Western trained Iraqi forces, however despisable, however diminished they could look, but they were trained and they were very, very well equipped. So, and even if you take equipment from them, you have you need professional knowledge of the military issues, how to use that equipment. So behind ISIL's success is not only ideological craziness in all of those leaders, but professional management, professional command of armed forces. And that's what makes them so strong today in fighting Americans, for instance, or American-led coalition, despite total control of the air. They are still fighting very, very tough, against professional armies. So they are professionals there. And who are those professionals? Those professionals are mostly professional military officers, professional from Iraq, trained mostly by Russians, by Soviets even, and Russians, under the cooperation Baasist party, which was seen in the communist Soviet Union as ideologically close and so on and so forth. So those are Baasists. It was probably a mistake by the Bush administration, which is still discussable. It's always easy to mark, the previous administration, but it was not as easy at that time. I saw that. So, but anyway, whatever was it a mistake or not, but when Americans came to Iraq, they just threw away the army, the professionals from the army, from Iraqi army. And those guys, many of them, they found their way to command ISIL forces, and that's why they are so professional, that's why they are so efficient militarily. So again, those guys were trained in the Soviet Union. They had very, very close comradeship with the KGB, and I tend to believe that there are more than we think contact still and understanding. So for these two reasons, and there are many other reasons, Kremlin, the Putin's Russia will never seriously fight ISIL. So that's total illusion. What else? China, Russia will never join the United States in anti-China alliance, not because they love China, but because they fear China. And America, it was easier to pick up the phone and to speak to the president of Taiwan, but then it very, very soon comes home to White House, to Americans, that it's not so easy, because China is superpower economically also, and militarily and nuclear superpower. So, I mean, even American president has to kind of calm down, and now I don't hear anymore even, that we will, the day one, I will pronounce them manipulators of the currency manipulators, the China and so on. I mean, it's all calm down because it's China. It's nothing to play with. For Russia, it's even more so because we have the longest land border with them, and Siberia is full of Chinese, and the discipline and influence of the Chinese diaspora should not be discounted too. So I mean, it's very, very dangerous play against China, and Moscow will not do that, however reckless they are. So what else for the grand bargaining? Nothing. So, but it doesn't mean that there are no small steps depending on what real relationship was and is between present administration in America and Putin's regime there, that there is no room for sliding down. And, those guys, with all due respect, they are military, yes, not sliding down in nuclear juxtaposition or in big military, schemes, but sliding down on Ukraine or something, that remains to be seen. And there is room for the president, because in the end, it's the president who makes decisions. And with all due respect, however strong general you are, you will not challenge president on every small step, right?
So, well, we'll see, I suspect. Thank you very much for that. There's a lot to think about there, especially the Baathist-Russian military connection, which is very interesting. Arkady, you have some comments on?
Yeah, just two brief comments. One thing I wanted to share, again, it just might be useful it's so easy to fall into cliches on either side. Now, when President Trump was elected, I called two politicians in the former Soviet Union to speak about Trump's victory, because their comments I was most interested in. One of them was Mikhail Saakashvili, the former president of Georgia. The other was Alexei Navalny. So that we just don't fall into the idea that Navalny is
conjured from nothing. He's been a serious person, is what you're saying.
Well, that he's also not necessarily a liberal Democrat kind of figure. Both of those politicians welcomed Trump's election. Navalny proposed a very interesting line. He said, "I think this is great. I think," said Navalny, "Trump's election is very good for me." I said, "Why?" I said, "Because I'm Trump." In a sense that only in a sense that I'm the anti-establishment figure. That Putin, Medvedev, all his people who've been in power since 2000 are the establishment. They're corrupt, they're unjust, they're corporatists, they own everything, yachts, models, land, palaces, etc. Navalny is an outsider. He's a political outsider. He is not a former prime minister. He's not a former politician. He's come from nowhere. He sees himself as, again, the parallel should not be stretched, but he sees himself as somebody who can challenge the traditional establishment. And that's what people are now responding to. Because as Minister Kozyrev said, injustice is a very, very big thing. It changed overnight in the late 80s. When the whole country, which is why it was so unimaginable, we all thought that Gorbachev had power. And then suddenly everything flipped, because suddenly everybody decided Yeltsin has power. And Yeltsin was actually Yeltsin was more predictable than in some ways. So that's one remark which I think is important to bear in mind. The second thing is my concern is not at all that that Putin and Trump will do ground bargain. I completely agree with Andrei that there is nothing Russia in a big way can offer. You know, the minute Trump says, "Can you deliver us China?" Russia can't. The Chinese are very, very realistic about Russia. I mean, the Chinese have fantastic expertise in Russia. They know Russian weaknesses, and Russia can't deliver China because it's not in Russia's power. My worry is not that there will be some ground bargain. My worry, real worry, is the opposite. What I mean by that is, and that's why I think the Kremlin does have a problem, not ideologically in terms of, I agree, they can manipulate whatever, they can turn anti-Trump, but turning against President Obama or candidate Clinton was a very easy game. You knew how they were going to react, okay? Which is they're going to stand back and do nothing. Obama would call Russia irksome regional power. You know, say Putin is not a grown-up. He is like a boy at the end of a class, mischief. So Putin always had escalation dominance. So he could do things knowing perfectly well the Americans are not going to come in. Either in Ukraine or Crimea, as was true. It was the US administration that held Ukraine back from fighting for Crimea. As the US administration of Bush held Georgia back from fighting against Russia in 2008. So, yes, Putin can turn Russian propaganda against Trump, but it's a very dangerous game because what happens next? Trump, who is unpredictable, who is very thin-skinned, who is incredibly vain, was Trump Towers, who takes everything very, very personally. Can you imagine, can you predict Donald Trump's reaction when Russian propaganda starts ridiculing him? Can you predict that when Russia starts not just ridiculing him and saying he is an idiot, whatever, but when the Russian military starts buzzing American naval ships, wherever, in the Mediterranean or anywhere else, you could know that President Obama would say, record what the Russians are doing and do not respond, do nothing, do not escalate. Can anybody sitting in this audience can actually put a bet that President Trump, at a point where the Russians start coming too close to American naval ships and his situation at home is not that great, he just lost Obamacare, etc., he is now going to say, I told you I was going to be stronger than Obama, shoot them if they come within 500 yards. I certainly wouldn't put a bet that Trump is not going to issue that order. And as a military, you would have to obey it. Now, what happens if the Americans do shoot down a Russian aircraft? I have no idea. You know, we've seen some examples in Turkey. When the Turks actually did it, Russia immediately backed off. As I said, combination of the economy, it's never one factor, but the combination of economy, of the protests, of anti-Americanism is the only effective thing. What would the Russians do? Would they actually test a tactical nuclear weapon? I have no idea, but I think the real danger of the Trump and Putin presidents together is when you have two very unpredictable people. They may like each other from the beginning. They're both nationalists, but then Stalin and Hitler liked each other from the beginning. And I'm not drawing parallels at all on one side, and I mean genuinely not drawing parallels. No, I'm not drawing parallels, but we do know that nationalists by nature, historically, do need an outside enemy. And I wouldn't again bet that President Trump is not going to recognize that actually turning against Putin might be a lot more beneficial for domestic reasons. And I think then we're in the escalation pattern, which is incredibly dangerous.
Very interesting. Thank you. And must make the Baltic states and some of the neighboring countries also.
Well, I think it should make all of us actually pretty nervous.
Yeah. So we're going to, we have a little time left. We're going to ask questions from the audience, and also I'm following your questions online, those of you who have sent them in. If I could ask that you be very concise and that you be sure that you are actually asking a question and not offering a soliloquy just because time is quite short. So, questions? This gentleman right here has a question. Oh, wait for the microphone, please. There you go.
I just came back from a conference in D.C., and the panel of Central East European experts discussing Russia agreed that there was last 8 years basically uncontrolled, I would say, aggressive expansion of Russia. And what is needed, in their opinion, is a pushback. So my question is, what kind of pushback you can offer to new U.S. administration, to European Union, to stop this expansion in Europe and Middle East and potentially reverse it?
Good question. Arkady, you want to start?
Again, can I just refer you back to that document which I mentioned, to the 1946 Cannon Telegram, because I think the reason it's so important is that he understood that Russia's aggression is not the result of its strength, it's the result of Russia's insecurity, a very deeply grounded insecurity for geographical reasons, for historical reasons, not the insecurity of the Russian people, but the insecurity of the Russian governments throughout the centuries, who cannot stand comparison with Western governments, with the Western living standards, etc. So Russia is not acting expansionally because Putin is rebuilding an empire. As far as Putin is concerned, he is acting in defense against what he sees as American interventionism in the former Soviet space, the color revolutions, particularly the events in Ukraine, the protests in Moscow, which he does believe were sponsored by the US. So it's insecurity, it's defense, but in Russian, that doesn't help us particularly because as one of the wonderful historians, Dominic Levin, I think, or maybe even was in Kennan's Telegram, wrote, the problem is that in Russia's case, the ideas of offense and defense are interchangeable. They're very easily mistaken. So they're acting out of defense, but they're acting aggressively. Russian history gives us a lot of examples of that. The Crimean War, in 1850s was one of those. So in terms of what the West can do, I don't think that, I think we have to stand, the West has to rebuild, or particularly America has to rebuild trust in the system of values, which is in the end what was so important in the defeat of the Soviet Union, because Gorbachev was not prepared to use force to put down the notion that America genuinely was freer, better and fairer society. So we need to rebuild that idea, both in the US and in Western Europe. And we need to stand, if we are going to say to Putin that no, there are red lines and you cannot go any further, then we need to be able to stand ready to enforce those lines, because drawing red lines and not defending them, saying in the Bucharest NATO summit that we in principle welcome Ukraine and Georgia, but we're effectively too scared of the Russian reaction, was inviting Russia's aggression against Georgia. So either we shouldn't be saying these things, or if we say these things, we should mean them and be able to draw and defend those lines, including providing much stronger military assistance to countries like Ukraine.
And actually that goes to one of our online questions here. Baltic states are in NATO now. Poland, Czech Republic, all in NATO. Are fears about NATO's commitment helping us or hurting us with Putin?
Do we have a choice? If Putin decides to probe NATO in the Baltics, which he might well do, if, as I said, the things with Trump escalate to the point where they do, not defending the Baltics will genuinely be the end of NATO. With America, what surprises me is in January 1992, Minister Kozyrev, I would love to hear what you think about it, but in January 1992, when the Russian people had defeated the KGB and the hardliners in the Communist Party, President Bush addressed the American people in Congress and the Senate, saying, by the grace of God, America won the Cold War. The expansion of NATO, which began in mid-90s, which actually Cannon advised against, was part of that idea of triumph. Now, if America is prepared to give up the victory, effectively, of its values in the Cold War, then God help us all.
So you're saying that it's
The
imperative.
Baltics should be worried.
Do you agree it's imperative that the U.S. make clear that we will defend?
What I agree with is that yes, the Canon telegram and the following strategy, which was adopted by President Truman and since then all the way, it worked. That was the strategy of containment, which included all factors, all segments, starting from, if you will, ideology, that is exactly defending the values, which is so-called liberal values. Basically, it's the Constitution of the United States. And on the world scale, defending those principles on the world scale, more or less, against communism, which was challenging exactly that, democracy. Today, it's still the same, it's continuation actually of the Cold War in that sense, that today Putin is the front runner of the world movement, again, like communism, a world movement to challenge democratic principles, to challenge the principles of the American society based on Constitution. And by the way, the kind of reading that President Trump, or interpretation that President Trump might present a challenge, a danger to constitution, to basic kind of liberal order or constitutional democracy in the United States, and some of those, unfortunate characterizations like media, whatever, false media, what is false media, naming major kind of outlets, major stations, respectable stations of the American media as enemies of the people. That's exactly the wording of the Cold War from Stalin till today's Putin. It's everybody, my humble self including, are enemies of the people, are fifth column and so on. I mean, in Russia. So I think that's why maybe they are misreading, maybe those are just figures of speaking, but there are many, unfortunately, figures of speaking like that are alarming to some American observers, and which were champagned in Russia. That's exactly what they welcome. They don't expect unilateral nuclear disarmament on American side, but they expect that their dream will come true, that they challenge the so-called liberal world, the backbone of which was America, based on free democracy and free speech, of course, and free media. So far, so good. So let's see. Maybe they are totally false on that, hopefully. But that's where their heart is, that this would be winning of the Cold War without a shot and from position of uncomparable weakness to America. Economically, I might be mistaken, but I'm sure that GDP of today's Russia is at least 10 times, not 10%. Arkady knows better this, but I believe it's 10 times less than GDP of America. And added to that, the European part of the free world, NATO part of Europe, that will be more than 20 times. 20 times. I mean, it's a dwarf, economically. And so Putin is on the weak side and on the weakening side, because even if American economic growth is not the real world, but still it's more or less stable 2% a year, while Russian was decline and stagnation already for a long time, and there is no perspective. Even Russian state propaganda does not claim that Russian economy will grow in foreseeable future 2% from that low level. So the gap is widening daily. I mean, my answer to the question, what to do, come back to good old practice of the containment, political, if you will, ideological, militarily, and other things. Yes, when the Soviet Union invaded Hungary in '56, or Czechoslovakia at that time in '68, NATO did not fought a war, but that was different situation a little bit. Nevertheless, the Cold War continued, and the total response, the response by all means was there. And what is also important is not to create false news and false impressions that Putin is just another guy. It's just nothing, you know. It's we have controversy over that and that. No, that more suitable to describe, I think, American-Chinese relations, despite Chinese are communists, but that relations might be described in there are points of cooperation, there are points of disagreement, but they are just points, however important, like South China Sea. While with Russia, the Putin regime challenges the basics of the Western civilization, of the NATO alliance, not so much even militarily, but I agree, ideologically or in the media and so on, across the board. So the answer should be, and it was rather successful. I mean, probably it was mischaracterization that America won the Cold War. We won the Cold War in Russia when we get rid by ourselves.
That's a good point.
From the
well
communists. And the Russian people will end this continuation of the Cold War when they get rid of the regime, of Putin himself and the regime in a wider sense. But it will be still victory for the
Russian
West.
people.
Yeah, for the Russian people and for the West.
Absolutely.
So it was our victory, but it was victory in the Cold War over a Stalinist regime. So that's the same story. So to make America great again, come back to great containment policy.
Oh, there you go. That's the quote of the day. That was beautiful. Thank you. So you have 45 seconds to tell us. Well, you're not going to top what we just heard, so I'm kind of giving you an unfortunate task here. But 45 seconds to wrap all this up. And this is a reminder. This book, this wonderful, wonderful book, The Invention of Russia, will be available on that side table when we finish. Okay, 45 seconds.
Well, I'm sorry we haven't had more questions. That's my biggest worry, because I think particularly from the young people, young faces I can see at the back, because those are the ones who matter. So I don't know if I can donate my wrapping points to at least one more question.
Does someone under the age of 18 have a question that they can spit out? Okay, choose somebody and hand them a microphone, please.
All right, grab one. There you go. I'm going to step on the side.
No, you have to talk real fast.
Okay, so first of all, it's an honor to be speaking to you and to be speaking to this room.
Okay, you have
You can
5
double that,
seconds.
it's all right.
That's an possibility, I'm sorry. But I think one of the most interesting points you mentioned was about how Putin and the Russian regime, they need an arch enemy. And now that they don't have the United States as their arch enemy, and since they cannot use China as their arch enemy, and since those two countries are effectively the two other superpowers, who can Russia blame, and what happens if they can't find somebody to blame?
They can always
Thank you.
find somebody to blame. They're very good at that. They can turn against America. As I said, the danger is that this time around, doing kind of anti-American thing could have consequences which go beyond what we had last time. In terms of wrapping up, I think we're in a very, very dangerous situation, partly because there are two unpredictable, Putin, who likes to act unpredictably, President Trump, whose policies we still don't know. So number one. I think number two is we live it's not so much return to the Cold War, we are living with the consequences of the end of the Cold War. In a sense that America, the West has lost, the Cold War has been fantastic for the West. It sustained the West, it mobilized the West, it kept it intellectually on its toes. We've lost that. We believed in the end of history. We believed that liberalism was here forever, that it's a natural development. It's not. There is nothing natural about liberal order. And unless we mobilize ourselves and defend, and we've basically seized the initiative to the populists and the nationalists. And unless we reclaim that initiative, and the populists and the nationalists are offering simple narratives, people are not going to you cannot mobilize people by saying we'll have another trade treaty, we're going to have fiscal discipline, etc. Read, I'm not going to cite it, but please, particularly the young people in this audience, go back and Google a review written in 1940 by George Orwell about Mein Kampf. It's a one-page review in which Orwell explains why Hitlerism and militarized Stalinism are so attractive to people. That it's not hedonism that will drive us. The people need stories, they need narratives. And the third point is the reason I think this situation is much more dangerous than in the Cold War is in the Cold War, when Kennan wrote about containment and deterrence, the ideological lines coincided with geographical lines. America and the West were on the one side, the Soviet authoritarian or dictatorship or regime was on the other. The lines are no longer geographical lines. The lines are within countries. The lines are between you and those who are telling you that we can take America back to the great years of the 1950s industrial growth. The lines are between you and the nationalists and the populists. The lines are within Russia between Putin and those who came out, which is what we started from, who came out in the streets in Moscow. Those are the lines. You have very little difference. Let me assure you that you and your peers in Moscow have a lot more in common than you have differences between you. And similarly, some of people like Putin and Trump have much more in common than they have differences, which is not a recipe for peace.
So much to think about. Thank you all, and I apologize that we ran a little late, but it was worth it. And thank